Well, let us begin this morning. We are looking at Jacob. Quite the fella. When you take a look at his life and his journey, it reminded me of the chorus, where we talk about the Lord still working on us. Because there's no question that as we look at Jacob, from beginning really to where we are going to let off today, stop today, there are times when he is extremely faithful and he's following exactly what the Lord has asked him to do. And then there are times when it's almost like there's a fog that enters his mind or something, and he just wanders away and does his own thing, forgetting completely what the Lord has told him to do. The end result, of course, is when he goes his own way and he does his own thing, there is a problem, and things are not going well for him. When he returns to the Lord and follows after God, and God speaks to him and he does what the Lord tells him to do, then we see God's prosperity upon him and blessing upon him. There are a couple lessons that we learn from Jacob. First of all, I think, not that we can use for excuse, but we recognize that the Lord has great mercy and patience. And so when we look at how God continues to uphold the covenant that he made with Abraham that is now flowing through Jacob, and he renews that with Jacob, we see that the Lord takes the imperfections in you and I, and he changes them, and he works on us. And sometimes it takes a long time, but we have to be patient and we have to hold true. And Jacob shows us all kinds of different parts about human nature, but his tenacity in some cases, and his ability to keep pushing through, his faith, though at times, again, it seems to evaporate a little bit or we don't see it, but it's there. And so what I wanted to do this morning, we're going to go backwards just a touch. And we're going to work through a couple verses in Genesis 27, then 28, then 31, and then 32, and then 33, and 35. And the reason that we're going to do that is because we have to sort of look at the whole picture. We can't just jump to Genesis chapter 35 without looking at what caused some of what we see there. Okay? And so I want to take you through a fair portion of Jacob's life. Because in some cases, as we have seen many times before, when we move from chapter to chapter in the Bible, many years can pass in between before we come back to the accounts. So if you go back, and we've covered this before, but I wanted to sort of look at some key pieces in Genesis chapter 27. So this is the section, of course, when Jacob and Esau, and we have the deception and the blessing received, from Isaac. And so at this point in time, the deception has been found out. Esau has discovered that Jacob has, by really deception, really, by trying to help out God. Once again, we see that being a problem. Esau is very angry. Esau wants to kill his brother. And so then we see this plan that is hatched. So in chapter 27 of Genesis, starting at verse 43, where we see Rebekah, and she says, "Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, and arise, flee thou to Laban, my brother." So in other words, that's Jacob's uncle, to Haran. "And tarry with him a few days until thy brother's fury turn away, until thy brother's anger turn away from thee, and he forget that which thou hast done to him. Then I will send and fetch thee from thence. Why should I be deprived also of you both in one day?" So the plan is to take off and go to Uncle Laban's place for a while. Notice it says a few days. That's why I went back to this particular part. Because what we actually see is it's about 20 years before Jacob returns to Esau. okay, before the brothers reunite. So, and that to me, I thought, wow, here's a person's plan. Oh, it'll just take a few days, and that turns into 20 years. Okay, now when you look at that, I look at that, and I think, I always like to look at, okay, I'm 62, 20 years ago I was 42, what was I doing 20 years ago, right? And what has transpired in the last 20 years. That helps me to sort of get an idea of how much time, though it goes quickly, right? We always talk about that, right? All of those days, all of those years taking place, going by, and how easy it would be for some people to say, well, God's plan, forget about it, it's not going to happen. It's been years and years and years. Yes, sometimes it can be many years. Right? But God's putting, in a sense, it's like a chess game, or it's like a puzzle is probably a better sort of picture, where all of the pieces have to come into place, and God moves those things around, and then he brings it all back together again. And that's what we see with Jacob. So here, this idea, that Rebecca has, go for a few days, she didn't really know what she was talking about. And it turns into a much, much greater sort of length of time. When we go then there are sections here that we didn't cover in the past. If we jump to chapter 28, the reason I wanted to stop here in chapter 28 for a moment, this is of course where Jacob has the dream about the ladder. We're not going to talk about that particular dream, but what I do want to point out in chapter 28, starting in verse 18, okay, where it says, "And Jacob arose up early in the morning and took the stone which he had put for his pillows and set it up for a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city was called Luz at the first." So in one language it's called that, and in another it's called Bethel, so they're the same place. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, "If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I will come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee." So a couple things we see there. But certainly why I wanted to sort of highlight that particular section there is because this is where Bethel is founded. Okay? And we see, of course, the importance of Bethel throughout the Old Testament and into the New. And so this being God's house, or the house of God. And later on, what we're going to see is the Lord tells Jacob to go back to Bethel. Okay? And that's an important thing. And in a sense, Jacob's journey is like a full circle, right? He starts off here now in Bethel, and now he's going to wander away. And while he's away, right, and we know the story, right, with his uncle and the two daughters, and how he works for years and years and years, and then is sort of tricked, and then has to stay there for longer until he gets, quote-unquote, the wife that he really wants, and all of these things are happening. During that time, and after that, Jacob prospers, right? God prospers him, and he becomes very, very wealthy. And so we know that because when he returns to Esau, he comes with his big household, all right? But here the key piece, just keeping this in mind, this is where Bethel is founded, okay? And this is the place that God tells Jacob to come back to, all right? Then if we jump to, I did want to say one thing. I don't know about you, but I found verses 20 and 21, or maybe mostly 20, a little bit disturbing. To me, they were disturbing, right? Because here we have Jacob, and look at what he says, right? And if we look at it in just this singular verse, it sounds to me that Jacob is saying to God, in a sense, if you will do these things for me, then I'll follow you. And I found that disturbing, okay? Because in all of my sort of teachings and people who have spoken to me and what I read in the Bible, basically, we don't come to God negotiating. And this sounds to me almost like a negotiation, right? And the thing that we have to be careful with here, this is where sometimes translations, even the King James Version, which I believe is very, very accurate, the problem with some of the original text is words can have sort of multiple connotations, all right? And perhaps, and this is just some reading I've done on this, perhaps a translation might have been slightly more accurate because the original text word that they translated into if also has a sense of the idea of when. Okay? And if you put when in there, it's slightly better. Right? It's not quite as demanding, so to speak. All right? So we kind of look at this, and it may not be that Jacob was actually sort of saying, God, if you'll do this, and you'll do this, and you'll do this, then I'll follow you. Okay? Because what we recognize in many other places in the Scripture, it's actually the other way around. Okay? We have to devote and we give ourselves to the Lord, and then God blesses after. Okay? It's not a payoff that we get because we're so good. All right? So we have to I'm bringing that to your attention, and I just found that particular verse kind of interesting, or as I said, it disturbed me a little bit because it sounded like Jacob was sort of pushing. Now that's not to say, as I think about this, it's not to say that people don't do that. Okay? And so we have to be careful, because perhaps that it was exactly what Jacob was doing. Maybe he was saying to the Lord, right? I'll follow you if you do this for me, you do this for me, you do this for me. Then I'll be your faithful servant. Okay? And so, we have to be cautious that our prayers don't come across or that isn't what's in our heart that we're saying to the Lord, right? Because I think a lot of people might think that way. And we have to just be asking God to help us so that that's not the way we are. All right, so now I want to go, we'll jump to chapter 31 for a second, and we will jump to chapter 32. Okay, and I just mentioned in chapter 32, and we're not really going to do too much reading here at all, but chapter 32, we have the account, basically, of, Jacob is getting ready to come back to be with his brother, okay? And so my point here is that when you're reading in chapter 32, and, the Lord sort of speaks to him here, and tells him to go, and Jacob is getting ready, and he's distressed because, all of these 400 people are coming on the other side, and he's worried that Esau hasn't forgiven him after all of this time, and that also speaks about how long people can keep grudges and keep bad feelings. But just note, somewhere I've noted in my Bible, that chapter 32 is basically 20 years after chapter 27, where he leaves. Okay, so everything sort of in the middle has taken 20 years roughly to transpire. Okay, I wanted to touch on one verse though, if you go back to chapter 31, and it's verse 3. Chapter 31 and verse 3. This is the first time here that the Lord speaks to Jacob and tells him to go back. Okay, and that's why I'm highlighting this. Right, so it's in verse 3, chapter 31 and 3. And the Lord said unto Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. Okay? So that's God's instruction that sort of gets Jacob going so that he returns then and makes these steps in chapter 32 to go back. And then in chapter 32, let's pick this up at verse 21. Okay, and here we have the account of Jacob wrestling with, as my Bible says, with an angel. What we discover, though, is very often in the Old Testament where it says angel of the Lord, it's actually speaking about God. Okay, and so here, really, and when we see that Jacob's name has been changed to Israel, that also further gives us evidence that Jacob is actually wrestling with God. Now, the part about this that I want you to notice, it appears that Jacob is winning, right? Because Jacob is holding on to this angel of the Lord and refusing to let go. And I pondered that for a while, right? Because is there anybody here, even if all, in all the world, is there any power great enough to actually hold on to God so that God couldn't do what he wanted to do? And the answer is no. So in my Bible here, I have noted this as actually God proving Jacob's determination. And as we read this, I want you to see, right, that really what's happening here is that God wants to see how determined is Jacob. Because what Jacob wants, he doesn't want to beat up on this angel of the Lord or anything like that. He wants a blessing. Okay? And so Jacob is determined not to let go until he receives a blessing. And there's the lesson for you and for I. Okay? That we need to have that same determination. And that determination needs to display itself, come forth from us in our faith and in our trust. That no matter what happens, no matter what the situation, we're not going to let go of God, right? Because we know that if we hold on, we will receive a blessing. And that's simply because we're part of the family of God. We're then part of who God is. And that blessing will be ours for our faithfulness, for our trust in him. So when we start to read here at verse 21 in chapter 32, this is what we see. Okay? So went the present. So what's happening now is Jacob is sent everything that he has. Okay? All of his servants, all of his possessions, and he has sent everything over to Esau. All right, across the river, all right, and he is now alone, okay? And so in verse 21, it says, so went the present over before him, and himself lodged that night in the company, all right, or the camp, that means. And he rose up that night and took his 2 wives and his 2 women servants and his 11 sons and passed over the ford Jabbok. And he took them and sent them over the brook and sent over that he had. Okay, and Jacob was left alone. So he had sent everybody across this brook, okay, this stream, this river, all right, and now he is alone. He stayed behind, okay, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he, this is referring to the man now, and I circled that and I put God there. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. But the point here is, Jacob still doesn't let go. Okay? So I mean, God could have released himself from Jacob at any time. That's the point here. All right? Jacob isn't powerful enough to hold on to an angel or a servant of God or anybody like that, right? They could have released themselves from Jacob at any time. But I don't know if you've ever wrestled. I thought about this, right? If you've ever wrestled, actually formally wrestled or done any kind of, I suppose, wrestling as kids do or whatever, but real wrestling is exhausting, because you are constantly pushing and pulling and you're entwined and one's trying to get up over the other. It's an extremely exhausting endeavor. Right? And as that has continued, it says, until the breaking of the day. So in other words, they've been at this for a long, long time. And my point that I keep reiterating here is Jacob doesn't give up. And even after the angel or the Lord touches the hollow of his thigh, and it says the hollow of his thigh was out of joint, so even after Jacob is inflicted and should be now weaker to the point where most of us would say, I give up. Jacob doesn't give up. Why? Because he says here in verse 26, and he said, let me go. Okay, this is now the Lord, or let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, Jacob, that would be Jacob, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. Okay? So Jacob is determined to receive a blessing. And no matter what the situation, he's not going to give up until he receives it. And he said unto him, what is thy name? So this is now the Lord speaking to Jacob, says unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. Now obviously, the angel of the Lord knows what Jacob's name is. Okay? But the fact that Jacob has to state his name here is also really important. Because what does the name Jacob mean? It means supplanter or replacer. It's not a really nice name, so to speak, right? It doesn't mean good things. And so as Jacob states his name, in a sense, he is confessing his past behaviors. Okay? I'm a supplanter. I'm a replacer. In other words, I've taken the place of someone else that perhaps by birthright should have been here, but I have taken that place. Okay? And that name is the name then that is changed. Okay? Because that's no longer who he's going to be. So this is both symbolic and important. It happens in reality in verse 28. And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Okay? So it's this idea of prevailing. It's the idea of victory. And the word Israel, okay, and in my Bible it says a champion of God, and then if you look in that actual verse it says for as a prince. So some people translate it as prince of God, but another translation for the term Israel means he struggled with God. Okay? And that word struggle talks about the fight, talks about just how he's never going to give up, the determination. Okay? And so when we see that in Jacob, we have to ask ourselves, do we have that same determination? Are we willing to struggle and hold on regardless of what happens to us? Okay? And I believe we need to have that. All right? In verse 29 it says, and Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. So Jacob here sort of says, who are you? And this person that he's been wrestling with, this physical being that he's been wrestling with, says, and he said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask my name? And he blessed him there. Okay? In a sense, the Lord's saying, why do you have to ask my name? Don't you know who I am? Okay? Haven't you recognized me by now? Okay? And then he blesses him. So if you look at all of the pieces there, and it's a little bit tricky, you kind of have to go through, because the scripture doesn't say, and God said, and Jacob said, and God said, and Jacob said. You have to sort of follow, because it uses those pronouns, right? He, so he said, and then he said, and you have to figure out who's talking when. And you can tell that because really only the Lord can bless. And so every time we see that sort of comment, you know that's God who has been speaking that piece. All right? And so in the end, God blesses him, all right, in verse 29, and he blessed him there. And then Jacob, verse 30, Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. So there's another sort of reason why, because Jacob says so, that he has seen God face to face, right? So in other words, he's been wrestling with the Lord. He's been wrestling with God, seeing God face to face. And so as was cultural tradition at that time, right, wherever those sort of important events took place, they set up altars in commemorative sort of fashion, right? And so they named those places based on the events that took place there. So that's why Bethel was set up, because of the rocks that Jacob was sleeping on when he saw the ladder dream. And now here, after wrestling with the Lord and receiving the blessing, he sets up another sort of place here to commemorate that. And then verse 31, and as he passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. He halted, he limped. Okay, there was still a problem. He still had that thigh out of joint. And then that is why the Bible tells us, therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrank. All right. So that became then just something that the children of Israel, children of Jacob, right? Because Jacob becomes Israel, and so his name becomes the name of a nation. And if you think about the name, it still suggests that struggling with God, that holding on, that determination. And when you think about, in particular now, the nation of Israel, right, having gone through all kinds of trials and tests, yet they continue to exist. And if we sort of take that as something that the family of God needs to have that same characteristic and determination, though it looks like it's game over, God's people need to hold on to the Lord and continue to exist. Okay? Because God's not going anywhere. And so the question is, what's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to God's family? The Bible tells us there will always be a remnant. And so my personal goal is to always be a part of the remnant. Regardless of how tiny that piece might be, I want to be one of those that is part of the remnant, still hanging on like Jacob hung on here. Okay? So that takes place. And then in chapter 33, which we're just going to read a small section of, in chapter 33 we see this reunion formalized between Esau and between Jacob, right? And, if you read chapter 33, verse 1, Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And then he divided the children unto Leah and unto Rachel and unto the two handmaids. And this was covered, right? He sort of basically took everything he had and divided it into two, with the hopes that if Esau and his 400 men have come to destroy them, at least some remnant would survive. Okay? And so he does that. Of course, Esau has come with a completely different desire, and we see that in verse 4. And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And so after 20 years plus, roughly, right, there is this amazing reunion, and obviously a spirit of forgiveness here, all right? And as a result of that, the two brothers don't necessarily stay living together, right? They're going to separate, but there has been now, all of the trouble has been taken care of, and so now they are once again united. And I want to pick this up a little bit here now at verse 17. This is after verse 16, where it says, so Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. So Esau's going home. Now, where was Jacob supposed to go? And that's why we read that other part before, right? He's supposed to go home as well, right? Which the Lord later clarifies, just in case, is Bethel. He wants him to go back to Bethel. And now, in this particular section of Scripture, a short little piece, and then in chapter 34, which we're not going to study at depth, Jacob runs into trouble. And it's another example, and I want to make sure we covered this, that he runs into trouble because he doesn't do what God has told him to do. And can we not all, if we're honest with ourselves and before the Lord, right? I run into trouble when I don't do what the Lord tells me to do. Simple as that. Okay? And here, rather than going back to where God tells him to go, he sets up camp in Shechem. All right? So in verse 18, verse 17, let's say, and Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and built him an house, and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, and pitched his tent before the city. And he bought a parcel of a field, where he had spread his tent, at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And then he erected there an altar, and basically he settles there. Well, that's not where God told him to settle. Okay. It looked good, obviously, and he could probably have, argued, well, I'm in the land of Canaan, right? Isn't that the promised land? Isn't that where, God, you told me to go? But see, this is the other thing that if we're not careful, this is what people tend to do. We make excuses, and we try and find these little loopholes, when in fact we know that we're not doing the right thing. And so Jacob doesn't do the right thing. And as a result of that, in verse 34, catastrophe, in a sense, befalls Jacob. His daughter, it says, one of his daughters, and Dinah, the daughter of Leah, without going into, what basically happens, she's raped by the men in Shechem. Then the her brothers want revenge, okay? And then there's a plot that's basically hatched. It looks like there's going to be a peaceful deal. So the men of Shechem say to Jacob and his sort of family, they say, well, let's make a deal. We'll give you our daughters, because apparently one of the boys there, one of Hamor's sons, loves Dinah and wants her as his wife, and so they come up with this deal. You give us your daughters and we'll give you ours. Okay, and it looks like that's going to be the plan, but then Jacob's sons, they say, well, we'll only go along with that plan if all of the men in Shechem are circumcised. And so if you agree to be circumcised, then we'll give you our daughters and we'll take your daughters. Okay? But that's just a plan because, and you can read it, it's rather ingenious in a sense. After the circumcision ceremony has taken place and all of the men who were circumcised are in not fighting condition for a few days, you understand what I'm talking about, they're all sore and in pain, that's when then Jacob's sons and his other servants come into town and they slaughter all of the men. Okay. That, of course, creates animosity and fear, and and basically at that point in time, finally Jacob recognizes that he has to go back to Bethel. He's in the wrong place. That God hasn't blessed him here. There's been trouble. There's been chaos, and so they have to get out. And so let's jump to chapter 35. I guess, see, and as I said, where you think he's still working on me, God was constantly working on Jacob. And Jacob would take a step back and make a mistake, and then the Lord had to straighten things up, and at times it wasn't a pretty picture. But if we jump to chapter 35, the first verse, it says, God reminding him, and God said unto Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there, and make there an altar unto God. Because I sort of skipped over that verse at the end of chapter 34, but it says, and he erected there an altar, right? So when Jacob stopped in Shechem, he put up an altar. But that wasn't the place that God wanted him to be. So in chapter 35, he tells him, go to Bethel, and there, right? There, make there an altar unto God that appeared unto thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother. Okay? So he wants him to go back to Bethel, where God appeared to him with the dream about the ladder, where he put that rock, right, as a remembrance, and he wants him to go back there and build an altar there. Then Jacob said unto his household and to all that were with him, put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. This is a big piece, right? Because not only does this give us a hint of what happened to Jacob and his household when they were in Shechem, but it also tells us what all of us need to do when we are looking to return to the house of the Lord, when we want to come back to the Lord, right? Because it is easy to stray. And over the time that Jacob is away, and particularly we believe when he's building there and he's living close to Shechem, right? What's happening? They're picking up things of the world, I'll use that term, right? So they have accumulated strange gods that are among you, it says, right? Put away the strange gods that are among you. They accumulated these things as they settled in a place where God didn't tell them to settle. So amongst the family problems that were there were all these other issues. And I would probably say that the family problems came about primarily because they started to adopt some of these other things. Even the idea, stop and think about this, even the idea that they were making a supposed deal that we'll give you our daughters and you give us your daughters. That's absolutely contrary to what the Lord speaks to the children of Israel. They're not supposed to mix with the unbelievers, right? They're supposed to stay pure and stay separate because God recognized the influence that the outside cultures could have on his family. And so that's not what God wanted. And so, they had picked up all of these strange things. So before they can go back to the house of God, before they can go back to Bethel, Jacob says we have to get rid of all this stuff. Okay? So we have to put away all of these strange gods that are among you. And then he says, and be clean. Now that statement in itself, it's just, 3 words. But he's talking there about ritual purification. So if you go back into the Bible, you will see that God had rituals and process for purification. So he's talking about there, getting rid of the strange gods. That's a physical act. Being clean, he's now talking about a spiritual thing that has to happen. Okay. So I can look really nice on the outside, but my inside can be pretty dirty. And so we have to be clean spiritually as well. And then a symbolic thing, but again, speaking about the change that Jacob says has to take place, and change your garments. And we see that sort of symbolic reference made in the New Testament, right? Where we put off the old and put on a new, okay? And it talks about the Spirit of the Lord and the blood washing our garments white as snow, right? So all of these things connect together. So Jacob, see that, and that's quite the turn all of a sudden, right? Once again, we see like what Jacob is doing there is very, very proper and right. The question I keep asking myself is, why didn't he do this in the first place? And I suppose the answer is, that's the danger of our carnal nature. If we let down our guard, if I let down my guard, if I think I can walk alone, even for a moment, the enemy is there and can come in. Okay? But he turns everything around. They clean up, they get rid of the gods that they've got, they get clean, change their garments, and then he says, and let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. And there's no question, God was with him every place that he went. The bigger question was Jacob following him everywhere, or obeying? And I would have to say, based on what we've seen, was not always the case. In verse 4, and they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. So everything that was symbolic at that time of false religions, different cultures, all of those things, they had to purge those things. They had to get those out. Okay? And they buried them. And that was symbolic of putting those things to death. Okay? We're going to get rid of those things. And so that was important, and that all happened before they began their journey. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. And that's an important verse, because that shows God's protection. Remember what happened in chapter 34, right? The sons of Jacob, in other words, his household, right? They had performed a pretty big slaughter of people in Shechem. And so the other cities and other tribes and other people around, they heard about that. And so one of the things, if you read in chapter 34, one of the things Jacob is worried about is that all of these other cultural groups, other tribes are going to come and they're going to get them. Right? But it tells me there that God protected them by putting the fear of the Lord, or the Bible uses terror of God, the fear of the Lord upon all of these other cities that were round about. We also have to remember here, I'll just throw this in this particular time in the world, cities were kingdoms. Okay? So when it talks about some of these kings and different things, it's not like we think today, big countries, right? They're talking about cities, communities, regions, in a sense, all right? And so when, he was worried about these other people coming to get him, that's because they had to pass now through this area, right? And so God makes a way for them so that they are not pursued, all right? So Jacob came to Luz, which is in the land of Canaan, that is Bethel, he and all the people that were with him, and he built there an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God appeared unto him when he fled from the face of his brother. So referencing back again to when it happened originally. Okay, El Bethel means the God of Bethel. All right, and then we see, and Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died. So we see some different family events happening. And verse 9, and God appeared unto Jacob again when he came out of Padanaram, and blessed him. And God said unto him, thy name is Jacob, thy name shall not be called any more Jacob. So he's reaffirming this. But Israel shall be thy name, and he called his name Israel. And God said unto him, I am mighty, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. Now, that's a command, you'll remember, that God gave to Adam and Eve in the garden. Be fruitful and multiply. Right? So this isn't the first time this has been given. So God, in a sense, he's starting things over again. All right? And he says, a nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins. And the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed after thee will I give the land. And God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, even a pillar of stone. He poured a drink offering thereon, and he poured oil thereon. Jacob called the name of that place where God spake with him Bethel. Okay, so he's finally back where God wanted him to be. I will close, because I'm running out of time, just on one last point I want to bring to your attention, and it's verse 11. Okay. And in verse 11, we see reference to a nation and a company of nations. And that's rather interesting, okay? Because this appears to be the first place, and then it also talks about kings, plural, okay, appears to be the first place where God is speaking about his blessing not just upon one nation, but upon a company of nations. Okay? And if we look in the New Testament, I'm not going to turn there, but we certainly see that as the disciples go out and they are sharing the gospel, right? The word of God was no longer just for the children of Israel, for one nation, but it was for anyone that would receive. Okay? So we can sort of extrapolate, or we could take from this particular place here, that what God is saying, that from Jacob comes not only a nation, but a company of nations. So I see like this spreading out like this way, all right? That God says he is going to bless. That God says he is God Almighty, and he wants Jacob and his people to be fruitful and multiply, because all of this shall come from him, all right? And so this is really referencing to the fact that God is for anyone that will receive, okay? Not just one nation, but a company of nations. So all those that will hear, and all those that will receive and turn their life over to the Lord, it doesn't matter, right, what we think today our background, nationality happens to be. The most important credential, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to call it a credential, the most important birth certificate that I can have is that I belong to the family of God. Period. Okay? And God says he will bless his family. So Jacob, tumultuous sort of journey, right? And so I'm so glad mine seems to be a lot smoother than that, right? But we have to stick with the Lord and do exactly what he tells us to do. Not try and help him so much as just make sure we're obedient. When God tells me to do something, or he tells you to do something, make sure you do it. And if God hasn't told you to do it, just be like Jacob when he was wrestling. Hold fast and don't let go until the Lord tells you to do it. At that point, then you're free, and it's no problem. But when we try and speed things up or do it ourselves, could have been that resulted in a 20-year delay. We have no idea. Right? But it took a long time for things to get back to where God wanted them to be. May the Lord bless you, and let us continue now in the services.